And that's kind of what most people get wrong. They think that if we have a central bank digital currency, then that means that Jerome Powell is going to come out tomorrow with a press release saying, well, oh, by the way, we were using this dollar, but now we've got this thing called Fed coin that you can use, that's a CBDC, that you can use that in lieu of the dollar. And it's going to somehow compete. That's incorrect. So the way you've got to think of it as CBDC is just simply a dollar.
Digital
Well, or all dollars now almost are digital. It's just a dollar that instead of being a liability of Wells Fargo or the commercial banking system is now a liability of the Federal Reserve, the central bank. Or that you're unifying these ledgers towards basically one ledger system. That's really the foundation for a central bank digital currency. And that's what allows the central bank to do all the things that we're worried about. All the big brother stuff, all the Orwellian things, the social credit score, and probably most importantly, it gives the central planners the ability to issue credit, not based on merit, but based on narrative. So you really got to pay attention to not what they're calling the CBDC, because it's going to be called a dollar. But are my dollars a liability of the commercial banking system? Are my dollars a liability of the Fed? Or has the Fed, or the BIS as an example, unified all these ledgers for basically they're one ledger that's under the control of the central planners and the authoritarians? So I'm a white, straight male, let's say. My interest rate is going to be 10 percentage points higher than like Dylan Mulvaney.
Right, to make up for your white privilege, yes.
Well, not only to have white privilege, but he's male. Trans, and now
I'm saying yours will be higher to make up for the current narrative, which is white, straight male privilege.
Yeah. And what's interesting about Dylan Mulvaney is I don't know how that would work, because he had male privilege up until about a year ago, but now he doesn't anymore. I don't know.
Point taken. That in the interest of diversity, equity, and inclusion, whichever minority or deemed to be minority group the narrative seeks to bolster would get more credit, would get an easier way, because it doesn't matter if they default or not.
That's right.
Because it goes back to the Fed.
That's right. And the real problem with that from an economic standpoint is we should incentivize lending or new creation of currency units through productivity. So as an example, if you go back to the 1800s, the late 1800s especially, we had something called free banking. So we didn't have a Federal Reserve. We didn't have the government intruding. Now, you could argue there's a little intrusion there, but we had the most free banking system that we've seen, but it's just on a separate balance sheet, right? We talked about it just goes from the commercial bank's balance sheet just over to the Fed. But I think they just have an algorithm, to your point, and it would basically be the exact same thing with this algorithm. Since they now have all the data coming in for every single transaction in real time, they can just take whatever you've spent today or just in the last 5 minutes and crunch that through that algorithm. And that algorithm, that would dictate your social credit score. And then based on your social credit score, that could go into the lending that we talked about earlier, or what that could also do is put a cap on certain usage or ways that you spend your money. And then if you do anything that exceeds that, either you're completely cut off or you have to pay some sort of tax.
Right. Again, a big concern that not many people are even noticing, but 130 countries are in active stages of exploring a CBDC or central bank currency. Now, their counter argument is that, no, this is fantastic because it deters crime, it deters money laundering, and it's also a way to fine-tune monetary policy.
Yeah. And I think we need to be very cognizant of that argument, because I think that's how they're going to pull the wool over our eyes. Because there are some very positive things about a central bank digital currency. It is very efficient. It's going to be very cheap. In fact, I think it'll be free. Where right now, as an example, you might have to pay, right? And another example that I use for people, I would consider myself a libertarian. I'm someone that advocates for freedom, liberty, and free market capitalism. So I am completely opposed to this type of system. And I think a lot of people would fall into that category that probably watch this show or that watch my YouTube channel. But I asked them a very difficult question, a very hard thought experiment. It's, take out your cell phone right now. And if I told you tomorrow that every single thing that you did on your cell phone would not only be tracked by the central government, but it would lead to you having a credit score or a social score, which would impact what you can and you can't buy. Would you stop using your cell phone? Yes or no? If every single person watching this video right now, if they answer honestly, the answer would probably be no.
Because we're too dependent on it.
That's right. So I think that's what they're going to do with the central bank digital currency. They're not going to announce it. They're going to route all these features to get you into the network to where you're completely integrated into the system. And then they're going to say, okay, by the way, now all of your dollar liabilities are on the Fed's balance sheet. And oh, by the way, we're rolling out this social credit score to kind of unplug out of the system as much as possible. But we need to be honest with ourselves. We can't just bury our head in the sand. So we have to realize that this isn't a matter of if, it's simply a matter of when. And unfortunately, most of the people out there are going to welcome a CBDC because they're not going to understand the downsides. They're just going to see these initial benefits that are presented by the central planners.
Well, the guys over at Wells Fargo, the strategist at the subsidiary there, in a new report, John Lafarge and Mason Mendez say that it'll be between 3 to 5 years.
Yeah.
Is that a realistic timeline for you?
I think so. And it all depends on the next crisis. We know one thing for sure, that the central planners and the authoritarians, they'll never let a crisis go to waste. So if you told me, George, we're not going to have another crisis between now and the next 5 years, I would peg that at maybe, we'll call it 50-50 probability. If you tell me that the yield curve is correct, we got an inverted yield curve. So that would imply that we're going to have a hard landing, most likely in 2024. And that could be something that looks like the GFC. If you said that's what we're going to have, then I would up that to 3 years and I'd up my probability to probably 75%. Because if a lot of these banks start to go bust, we talked about that earlier as well, are showing some of the downsides. My concern is that the Republicans really don't understand how it works. So the central planners that are really kind of pulling the strings here will be able to implement it without those Republicans even knowing it. Like that, or whatever politician you just talked about. If you went to that guy and said, okay, I know you're very anti-CBDC, but if we have this, let's assume we're in a banking crisis, would you be opposed to the dollar assets of Wells Fargo if they're going bust, just moving over to the Fed? He'd probably say, no problem. Because he doesn't even understand the back end plumbing. So how is he going to prevent something that he doesn't even understand if the central planners don't announce it, which they won't?
So no consolation that they may bring it to a vote for Congress if, as you say, it's framed in a way that it's a savior to a potential crisis or to a looming crisis.
Yeah, because we could be using a CBDC right now. The same thing, the same politician could be using a CBDC just to buy his morning Starbucks, and he wouldn't even know the difference. So that doesn't give, I'm glad that people are talking about it, but all this does is gives it more and more and more negative PR as far as the term, which just incentivizes the central planners to not tell us that they're doing it or give it some sort of other label